sort of thing, and then Scott Gunn responded, "The thing I need to hear every Good Friday."
Oh, I haven't heard of these.
Yeah, so 2 interesting blog posts that came out yesterday.
Just yesterday.
Yeah. Just the whole kind of anti-Semitism.
So yeah, I can see his. And
We'll just sort of have to pass this back and forth. If you have questions, I'll have it back to you. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Library of All Saints Cathedral here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And welcome to our last night of our series of discussions on the Passion narratives led by Bishop Miller and by guest scholars. This evening, we'll be looking at the Passion narrative in the Gospel of John. We are pleased to welcome back a friend of the cathedral, Woodrow Anderson, Woody. Woody's a professor of Greek and New Testament at Nashotah House Seminary. He was with us in the fall and led us on a 2-week exploration of the Gospel of Mark. And welcome back.
Thanks.
We also want to give our thanks to the Living Church, who once again is giving us access to their high-speed uplink to the internet. And I'm also happy to welcome you all back who are joining us on YouTube and who have joined us for these past few weeks. This has been a really fun experiment for us here in the Diocese of Milwaukee and at the Cathedral. And we would love to hear from you about your impressions of how things went, things that we could improve as far as content. We know that the next year we'll have a much better technical sense of how things are going on. But please drop me an email here at the Cathedral at kevin.carroll@ascathedral.org. You can find my email on our website or Bishop Miller's email on the diocesan website, dialmill.org. And you can access us through our website at AS Cathedral for All Saints, ascathedral.org. And if you're joining us tonight in real time, please feel free to offer up questions on our Facebook page. So without further ado, Bishop Miller and Woody.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody. Glad that you're here. Thank you to the Dean for hosting it. And just a brief word to say, if there's a topic that you'd like us to cover if we do this next year, we'd like to hear that, because we want to offer insights into questions that you have and parts of Scripture that you would like us to discuss, because we're committed to forming Christians more and more deeply in the story of what God has done for us in the person of Jesus Christ and the God who's revealed in the Jewish Scriptures and our Christian Scriptures as well. So thank you for that. Tonight we're talking about John's Gospel, and it might interest you that John's Gospel has been part of the blogosphere this week. 2 articles which I would commend to you for your study. One by Paul Rauschenbusch, the religion editor of the Huffington Post, commenting on John's Gospel, the thing I never want to hear again on Good Friday, and his concern about, as we spoke earlier, that parts of John's Gospel may be misperceived as being anti-Semitic, although I think both Professor Anderson and I would say that what we're watching is a family fight here going on, and these were Christian Jews who had experienced the separation of church and synagogue after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, and so John's community is living through that and in some ways reacting against that, asking the question, who are the true descendants of Abraham? I think that's one piece of that. And then there's a marvelous retort in Scott Gunn's 7 Whole Days blog, where he says the thing we need to hear every Good Friday, which is Jesus's triumph, of course, but also the fact that we are likely to be among those who clamor for his death, as well as those who would stand by watching, like Mary, and John. We are all those things.
Yeah, I think the important thing to say about the Gospel of John as it concerns the reference to the Jews, which is a frequent term in the Gospel of John, is that it becomes what we in the business what we call a technical term, which is an expression that means something rather more specific than it means in everyday parlance. So we would all, reading our English Bibles, read the Jews and think we're talking about people of an ethnic background. In the Gospel of John, it's talking about Jewish authorities who stand in opposition to Jesus in his ministry. And Bishop Miller has given the right historical background to that. It's because, as he says, there's a family squabble going on among Jews. Right, so all of the followers in the Gospel of John are Jews. They're not the Jews of the Gospel of John. So it's not about ethnicity. That doesn't mean that it's not open to an appropriation that could be anti-Semitic. Absolutely, it is, and that's a problematic part of the history of the interpretation of all of the Gospels, but especially the fourth Gospel. But that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism is intrinsic to the Gospel itself.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to begin with the first of our four scenes that we've been looking at each week. You remember the four acts of the Passion according to Raymond Brown are the first act, the trial in the garden. Act 2, the trial before Jewish authorities. Act 3, the trial before Pilate, and then Act 4, the crucifixion and burial. But when we come to John's Gospel, I think it's important for us, before we enter Act 1, to set the stage just briefly and remind ourselves that in John's Gospel, Act 1 comes after two specific things. One, Jesus giving the disciples a new commandment that they would love one another. And in John's Gospel, that is demonstrated not by a meal in which Christ says, "This is my body, this is my blood," but in his washing of his disciples' feet. And then immediately after that comes the section known as the high priestly prayer. And Jesus offers his prayer to the Father, praying for those who believe in him, who will be with him in paradise and all those things. So the Jesus who's entering into this scene in the garden is not a Jesus who's fearful and wondering. This is a Jesus who is very much in control, and we'll see that as we walk through chapter 18.
Yeah, that's a major theme in the Gospel of John. Of course, all of the Gospels believe that what takes place, not least in Passion Week, is under the sovereignty of God, not beyond God's knowledge or control in any sense. But what makes the Gospel of John different than that is it accentuates that point even more, but it includes Jesus in the sovereignty. Nobody takes Jesus' life, but that he lays it down.
Yeah.
Right. And he alone has the authority for what's about to transpire. Not he alone, but he with the Father has the authority for it to transpire. And that's a very strong, I mean, again, in the business, we would say a strong Christological emphasis of the gospel, helping us to see Jesus as also the sovereign one. I'm going to make one more point.
Sure.
It's just, I hope it won't sidetrack us, but it might help us think about how we're leading into these events. And that is, I want to posit the hypothesis for our consideration that the Gospel of John, on the one hand, stretches the ministry of Jesus over the span of 3 years, which is something you can't get out of the Synoptic Gospels. It doesn't mean that the Synoptic Gospels can't accommodate to 3 years. Absolutely they can, but you would never get it from the Synoptic Gospels alone, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that Jesus' period of ministry was 3 years. From the Gospel of John, we understand that it was 3 years because of the Jewish festivals. But John does one other thing that's interesting in that he stretches this time out in real chronological time. But I would also argue that the Gospel of John presents the whole 3-year ministry of Jesus as unto a Holy Week. as like what happens in the final week of Jesus' life in the Synoptics. And I think one of the signs that that's taking place is you remember that Jesus cleanses or judges the temple in each one of our four Gospels, and you remember that it happens on the second day of Holy Week in the Synoptic Gospels, but it happens in John chapter 2. It marks the beginning of his ministry.
Yes.
And so what we have in the Gospel of John is it's like you take Holy Week and you stretch it across 3 years. The character of that week in the Synoptics is the character of Jesus' whole ministry in the Gospel of John. And so one of the things that we see is that Jesus' opponents are eager to take his life. We find out about that hostility mostly at the end of the Synoptic Gospels, but all the way through the Gospel of John, we see them eager to take his life. They want to stone him. They're looking for opportunity. And that's a difference between the two. Jesus is under the press of that kind of opposition from the beginning of his ministry to the end. I think that puts the Passion narrative in a particular context as a culmination of something that's been brewing, if you will, for 3 years.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, because certainly many scholars would say that in fact, kind of one of the linchpins of that is that whole story of the man born blind in chapter 9, and then the whole commentary following on who the good shepherd is and what the good shepherd does.
Yes.
And as sort of a centerpiece
Yes.
of that whole thinking. Yes, I think that's very true. That's an excellent point to make, Woody. Thank you for that. So we end up, of course, then in the garden, and as John records it, Jesus goes with his disciples. He enters the garden, but there's no mention of Jesus being at prayer. There's not a mention of Jesus saying, "Father, take this cup from me." The first thing that happens is that Judas knew the place was, and the Pharisees, the chief priests, soldiers, and with police from the chief priests and Pharisees come at Jesus. And Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they respond, "Jesus of Nazareth." And then there is one of those ego eimi sayings, that I am he, is how it's translated. But it really was simply, if you look at the Greek, it's just I am, ego eimi. And so I am. So it's a statement right from the very beginning, a connection with his divinity. Wouldn't you agree, Woody?
I do, yeah. It's the ego eimi, I am statements are in each case in the Gospel of John, they're susceptible to a basic meaning. If you wanted to say, I'm the guy, you would say ego eimi. But if you're a Jew and you're reflecting on the scripture of the Old Testament, and especially God's self-revelation to Israel as the one who is what he will be, the I am of Exodus 3:14, then when Jesus says ego eimi, it has the potential to have a different level of significance. And that's just classic John narration, which is things that Jesus said can be taken at one sort of mundane level, but they're actually meant at a different level. And part of the fun of reading the Gospel of John is watching people negotiate which meaning Jesus intended. But it's clear that he means the higher one. And in this case, it is a claim on his lips to divinity.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we see it in the reaction
Right.
the second time it happens.
That's right. When he said, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, whom are you looking for? And he said, I told you that I am he, so if you're looking for me, that these men go, this was to fulfill the word he had spoken. I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the interaction with the swords again, which all four of the Gospels record, but this time it's named who did it.
Yes.
And it's also named who got his ear cut off.
Yes.
The servant's name was Malchus, according to John.
Yeah, and we would have no idea from the Synoptic Gospels that Peter was the guilty party. That only John tells us that. So if you are of a mind to harmonize such things, then you can assume in the Synoptic Gospels that Peter is that person. If you're not necessarily of that mind, it's another pointer toward the native impetuosity of Peter, that he just is an overreactor, probably born of a long line of overreactors. We don't know. But, that's a quote from what is that? Father of the Bride film. Yeah, right.
That's
okay.
right.
I was thinking, the text I was thinking of here is in 18:6, when he said to them, "I am," they drew back and fell
To the ground. Right, yes.
Yeah, so that's theophany scene. It's a theophany scene. They know that he's committing a blasphemy, and they know that they're encountering a God.
And theophany means appearance of God, for those of you who are wondering about that 50-cent word that Professor Anderson is using, but a good word. So, right.
It would only be a blasphemy if it's false. Right?
Well, that's right.
Right,
That's right.
exactly. We learned that the first week.
Yes.
You've been paying attention, Mr. Dean. You can get an A. All right. So there isn't a prolonged scene in the garden in John's gospel. Immediately, I'm using marked words here. They end up before the high priest, and we have the soldiers before. So we have Jesus they take him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year, and we're reminded that Caiaphas earlier in John's gospel had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people.
Yes, that's a famous instance of this kind of double meaning again. In fact, you could call this dramatic irony in the proper sense of that term. When Caiaphas says it is better that one man should die than the whole nation, well, of course, he means something very politically pragmatic by that. Get rid of the troublemaker, and we'll save our tails. But of course, in the larger context of John, he's pointing out a death that is redemptive on behalf of those people. And that kind of double meaning again is classic, John's classic style of expressing his theology.
Yeah, indeed. So then we move into that scene, and during that time we hear the story of Simon Peter's denial. And it's interesting that in John's gospel, the three denials are separated. They don't happen one after another. So we hear of the first two denials in this first section. Simon Peter, and Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about that another disciple, and we could go down that rabbit hole for hours. There's even a book written about it by Raymond Brown, who's been our guide through much of this, called The Community of the Beloved Disciple, which I commend to you. I have some of my own theories about this other disciple, which we could discuss another day.
Oh.
But we may get there. Or you may have to come hear me preach on Easter morning. But that's an invitation as well.
Well, that's kind of a high price to pay, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. All right. I love you too, Woody. All right. So Jesus and the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went with Jesus in the courtyard. But Peter ends up standing outside the gate. One who guarded the gate said to Peter, "Are you not also one of his disciples?" And Peter denies Jesus there. And Peter is standing with them, warming themselves. Then the high priest questions Jesus. And Jesus, this is not a Jesus who's silent in any way, shape, or form, is it? I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues, in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said.
Right. So this really shows Jesus, the Gospel of John, to kind of be the opposite of the Markan messianic secret.
Yes.
In Mark, Jesus has been speaking in mystery, riddle, hidden forms of speech. In the Gospel of John, that's not been true. And so he can say in the hour of his trial here, look, you don't need to ask me. I've been telling everybody the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's a little, I don't know, how does Jesus come off there? He comes off just a little bit edgy, I think, in putting it this way. But I think the point is to say that Jesus has been making the same kind of claims from beginning to end. And as Dean Carroll said, they're either true or you will have to take me as a blasphemer. Mm-hmm. There aren't really any other options.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
By the way, it might be we might point out that you're right in saying that Peter's denials here are spread out. Yeah. And I think the purpose is to kind of put the denials as a frame around Jesus' trial.
Yes.
So in a sense, Peter's on trial and Jesus is on trial. Peter is failing given 3 opportunities to speak the truth. Peter is failing, and that's surrounding Jesus' bold, open witness to his own identity. Right, and so there's a deliberate kind of contrast that's made there, which of course is preparing the way for the grace of Jesus as he meets Simon Peter after the resurrection, the one who abandoned him at his trial by failing in his own.
Right. Yes. Thank you. That's very good. So after that scene, after Jesus speaks to Annas, and Jesus is sent bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. We have the denials 2 and 3 of Peter. We've already seen the contrast of that, and so there's no mention here though of what happened with Jesus at Caiaphas in John's gospel. It says Annas took him to Caiaphas, and then they take Jesus from Caiaphas right to Pilate's headquarters. And it's not happening at night either. This is the other thing to note about John's gospel is this is all out in the open. This is the trial itself and the taking of Jesus to
That's
Pilate.
right.
Yeah.
And part of it is the timing has to be that way because Jesus' crucifixion is going to coincide with, and I might be getting ahead of you here, but it will coincide with the sacrifice of the Paschal lambs. And so, of course, that timing is a necessity for the theological point that we're about to see made.
Right. To say they're trying, indeed, very much so. So we then have Jesus before Pilate. So in John's gospel, scene 2, Act 2 is a very short act.
Right.
So then we move real quickly into the trial before Pilate.
But maybe it's just a side point there. The way that John has cast this is to place Pilate in a highly ambiguous kind of place. He comes off as, on the one hand, pleading his innocence, but his pleading his innocence is actually his pleading Jesus' innocence. If you follow me, like Pilate sees no reason why Jesus should be punished or crucified, and he makes more appeals in this gospel than he does in the synoptic gospels for Barabbas to be released, for Jesus to be let go, for Jesus to get to be off the hook, as it were, and yet for all of those appeals, he doesn't make himself any less responsible for the decisions that he's making. He's pleading on behalf of Jesus' innocence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think that's an excellent point.
So there's a longer Pilate scene and a shorter Jewish authorities scene.
Correct.
Which, by the way, is a little bit of a mark against the strain of thought that says John is thoroughgoing anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. What you would have expected is the opposite to happen.
Right.
There's a longer emphasis on Jewish responsibility.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And certainly we see Jesus before Pilate. Pilate asks them, what accusation do they bring? They say, if this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate says to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your own law. And they reply, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. This is to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Now, there certainly was a death penalty in ancient Judaism.
Well, this is a much debated question. I presume that's why you brought it up.
Indeed.
So there is of course, historical evidence that Jews had executed the death penalty, and here's a claim that we don't have the authority to do that. Probably the balance of evidence suggests that in exercising a death penalty, we're looking at something more like vigilante justice than a formal right that was granted under Roman authority. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, they're right in saying we can't do this,
right?
Which is not quite the same as saying we never have, mm-hmm. Right? Because we know stories of stonings, for example.
Right.
Well, how did that happen? That wasn't, the Romans didn't stone Stephen, right? So, but that's a vigilante kind of a justice, or injustice, as the case may be, rather than a formal right to do this.
What about when they stone people for adultery?
Well, that has to do. That would be the same thing, right? Maybe just at a lower level, street, on the street. Yeah.
And certainly it could also be referring to the fact that Jesus said, when I am lifted up in John's gospel, I will draw all men to myself. And so while they may have been permitted, had to put somebody that they couldn't, crucifixion was a particularly Roman rite.
And in fact, I wanted to get there when I started my comment, and I forgot to. So thank you. That's exactly right. Again, it's not the case that Jews had never performed crucifixions. Alexander Janneus, who is the wicked high priest that may have been responsible for forming by accident the Qumran community, crucified 800 people. So it's not like a Jewish leader had never done that before, but again, it was not proper.
Right.
Just because we have doesn't mean we can. But you're exactly right. When it says this was to
indicate the kind of death he was to die. Right.
It would be a Roman kind of death, which is to say the Son of Man would be lifted up.
Right, yes.
With another one of those double meanings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lifted up could mean exalted so as to praise. And lifted up, in this case, bears a dark meaning of being lifted up on the cross. But in being lifted up on the cross, lifted up and exalted to God at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So we then have Pilate. Pilate in this trial is pretty back and forth. He's outside talking to people. He's back in talking to Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus again says, do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Then Pilate utters all these kind of disclaimers. I'm not a Jew. These people have handed you over to me. What have you done? And Jesus replies, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this world. So Pilate says, are you a king? And Jesus again replies, you say that I am a king. For this I was born. For this I came into the world to testify the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth here listens to my voice. An echo of the good shepherd metaphors in chapter 10. And then Pilate's response, what is truth?
Mm-hmm. So it makes an interesting kind of question. Is Jesus owning kingship or not owning kingship?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Well, I think he is, but not the kind of kingship that people think of.
That's what I think. Yeah, I would have said the same thing. I'm going to let you use the word king because you're not wrong. But you're not right in the way that you might think. I'm not the kind of king that is a direct threat, say, to your authority or to the Caesar. Not direct. I mean, praise be to God, he's an indirect threat to all political authorities in an ultimate sense, but not in that direct sense. So I'm going to let you use the word king, but if I'm going to speak of myself, this is almost a weird juxtaposition. He says, you say that I am a king, but he says, for this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. So Jesus is speaking about a reason for being that far transcends kingship. What do you think? How much higher do you go from king? Well, how about coming to tell the truth?
Yeah.
To proclaim the truth and to reveal the truth of God to people. And that Jesus said, that's what I came into the world. That's for that reason I was born.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I'm a king is sort of, secondary, if you will.
It's certainly it's indeed or incidental. Although yet in this gospel we really see the fulfillment of that ancient hymn, God is reigning from the tree, but we're not quite there yet. So then there's the sentencing to death.
Well, could we talk about one thing before
we
go on?
Sure, yeah.
Pilate's reply.
What? Okay, yeah.
What is truth? What do you think of? What do you think why do you think he's asking that question?
Well, I've heard a number of people debate this, and I can never quite make up my mind. One is he's just kind of thrown up his hands. What is truth? Who cares about truth? I'm not in the truth business. I'm in the government business, and the government business is about getting things done. So I think there's certainly one So what? It's almost a what's it to me? What's what's it? So I think there's that piece of it, and then I think so. There's that piece, and then there's also the sense of the relative, and the varied truths that are out there.
Okay.
And so I get stuck.
Yeah. I'm a little more inclined to your first option, which the technical translation of that would be truth schmooth, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So I like what you're saying there. The political pragmatism sort of rules. I don't have time to talk about truth, but of course this is another one of these Johannine ironies, because for the reader of John's Gospel, we know, first of all, we know the answer to what is truth. I am the truth and the way and the life, right? So there is an answer to that question in John's Gospel. And secondly, the truth is not something to be dismissive about, but of ultimate importance from the perspective of John's Gospel. What is truth really matters. So Pilate here doesn't just look like kind of a disinterested politician, but somebody who's abandoning what matters most in life.
Yeah.
And standing right before the truth and saying, truth.
Truth smooth.
You don't think you could be having some kind of slight little existential moment right in the middle of this great drama that even it dawns on Pilate that something profound is going on at this point. And then he snaps back into reality.
What was I thinking?
Right.
Right.
I got lost in a philosophy class there for a second. I'm back now. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's possible. So your suggestion would be when he says, what is truth? It's like, this really makes me think. Kind of. That sort of.
Yeah. But then there's a crowd. And we get on with the business.
It would be nice to see some corroborating evidence, right? Like some other hints that the Pilate has a soul.
Right.
or we believe he has a soul.
Well, that's why you're a bishop and professor. I'm just a low redeemer. To ask these big questions.
I think that's a good one. I do think it's important what Woody said about the connection to truth is used all the time in John's Gospel. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Even in the prologue,
Full of grace and truth.
Full of grace and truth. And so the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So there certainly is that. After that, Jesus is sentenced to death, and he asks them if he wants to release him the King of the Jews, and they cry out, not this man, but Barabbas. We've talked about Barabbas over in our other classes, reminding that the word Barabbas may mean son of the Father in some ways, which is interesting because we're choosing between who is the Son of the Father, and then there's the public flogging of Jesus, and Jesus brings. Then they played him in the crowns. There's the mocking, which is recorded in the other Gospels as well.
So one of the differences, though, in John is that this mocking and scourging happens in middle of Pilate's trial, rather than at the conclusion of it.
Correct.
So this is one of the significant differences, and but one of the possible ways to take that is kind of on historical grounds. Is Pilate trying to say, look, if I rough this guy up a little bit, will that be enough for you? I think there's some plausibility to that. It reminds one of, and this is not to be political, but it reminds one of a kind of judicial or police kind of brutality, doesn't it? Like we haven't even passed a sentence yet, and yet we're brutalizing.
And we're going to work this guy over.
Exactly. Right.
That's right. And then we have Jesus, Pilate bring Jesus out. And again, the shouts of crucify him. And Pilate says, take him yourselves and crucify him. The Jews reply, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God. And then Pilate hears this and goes back and asks Jesus, where are you from? But then we have again Jesus not answering. And then another exchange with Jesus. And again, pointing out how Jesus is so much in control of this situation. Pilate says, do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you? And Jesus responds, you have no power over me unless it be given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. So in this way, we see Jesus' submission to the Father but also is one very clear that that is indeed what he's doing.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right. We're going to see as we go along, we're going to see a little bit more of Jesus exercising the sovereignty over himself and his own destiny that is the Father's first.
Yes.
But here it's really clear that it's only God could let this happen, right?
Right.
You think your vaunted power and you think you're calling the shots here. The fact is that you just aren't.
You're just not calling the shots. Yeah. So Pilate again tries to release him. Boy, Pilate sure is trying to release Jesus a lot in John's gospel, isn't it?
Yes, he does.
Over and over and over again. But then they cried, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who sets himself, a king sets himself against Caesar. And
that, probably epitomizes irony, of a situational irony in the extreme. We have all of these Jewish texts that tell us, a Jewish slogan, especially of the zealotic variety, was "No king but God." No king but God. We have that in multiple Jewish texts. And now when they say we have no king but Caesar, amazing kind of a claim. In other words, this is the level of the opposition that's come between Jesus and the religious authorities that are opposing him. It is so strong that they'd rather make common cause with their oppressor and the one who vaunts himself as God than to tolerate Jesus. It dramatically illustrates how far things have gone.
because we want to remember that the Roman emperors claimed to be both Lord and God, which is part of why many of the early Christians were persecuted for their unwillingness to offer incense to the emperor, as were many of the first Christian martyrs. And I would assume some Jewish martyrs as well.
Absolutely.
At times, yes.
That's right.
So,
I mean, it's not Rome, but it's the same phenomenon that we observed through the whole Maccabean revolt.
yes.
Is no God, but no
God.
king but God, right?
Exactly. So we end up with that, we have no king but the emperor. Do you think that John is particularly wanting to record that because to make the point to his first hearers that they are the true followers of the king, the ones who have remained faithful? Do you think that might be a reason that he lifts that out in the midst of this family fight?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think that maybe is as good as any explanation. So what we have here is that Jesus has been presented as the King of the Jews. And we've said that that's an ambiguous title for Jesus. And of course, we're going to see it on the placard in just a little bit.
Right.
The main point here is I think they're refusing Jesus as king.
Yes.
And of course, that's all the more egregious because in refusing Jesus as king, they're laying hold of Caesar as their actual king, which is here's Jesus being charged with blasphemy. Now they're making their own kind of blasphemy in making the pseudo king or the pseudo god into their king.
Right.
So I think it is meant to draw out that contrast, as you say.
Right, particularly when we remember that certainly by this time the early Christians would have had their beginning formulaic creed: Christus Kyrios, Jesus is Lord.
That's right.
And so that adds to that.
That's right.
To that piece of that.
Absolutely.
Right. So we come now to the crucifixion itself, and in John's Gospel, where having studied the synoptics the last 3 weeks, we're wondering, well, where's Simon of Cyrene? But there's no Simon of Cyrene in John's Gospel. Jesus picks up his own cross and so they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. And there they crucified him with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. And Pilate writes an inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. So he wanted the whole world to know who this guy was. Kind of the three great languages of the day.
Right. Do you think there's a reason why Simon of Cyrene doesn't show up here?
Well, I think it's because John wants to show a Jesus who is very much in control and powerful and in charge, and also that Jesus is destined to take up the cross rather than have it laid on him.
I think that's a good answer. And the language, your translation has it a little different than mine, but I think maybe even better, is bearing his own cross almost sounds like an emphasis, given that I think that John, the author of the gospel, knows the synoptic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I think this is a kind of a counterbalance. He's stressing that this is all about Jesus taking up his cross,
Mm-hmm.
and not in a sense needing that kind of help.
Right.
Right. I mean, that doesn't make Jesus not truly human or something like that, but it stresses the sovereignty that nobody takes his life, he lays it down.
Right. And that's certainly the point that John wants to make. And we see Jesus reigning from the tree even after he's put on the cross. When from the cross he says to his mother and the other disciple, the disciple whom he loves standing beside her, saying, "Woman, here is your son," and the disciple, "Here is your mother." Which leads us briefly into the other disciple question, which for me, one of the things that I've often wondered based on this passage and on the resurrection story in John's gospel is we often think the other disciple is John or the author of this gospel. And I've wondered, could that person be Lazarus? Because Lazarus, as you know, is the only one who could have looked in on an empty tomb and known what was going on. And Lazarus is the only one who in Scripture is referred to when Martha and Mary come to him and say, "Lord, he whom you loved is dead."
I think the case for Lazarus is pretty strong. I don't agree. But it's number 2 on my list of probabilities.
It's okay.
Yes, I do. Well, and you've made most of the key points, which are here's one person we know is described as Jesus loved. Very good.
Mm-hmm.
And then we don't have a reference to the disciple whom Jesus loved until Lazarus is raised from the dead.
Yes.
And then they start showing up.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be another argument. Probably the chief argument against Lazarus, if there is one, is that the early Christian tradition is uniform in believing that the author of this gospel was John.
Mm-hmm.
A person named John, I should say. And there's quite a bit of momentum for the assumption that if the author of this gospel is John, it must be John, the son of Zebedee, naturally an apostle.
Right.
But we have good testimony of John the presbyter
Mm-hmm.
as a person distinct from John the apostle.
Right.
And of course, it would take us too far afield to get at this. I think that John the presbyter is more likely the author of the gospel than John, the son of Zebedee.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's not John the presbyter, it's Lazarus.
Yeah.
How's
Or
that?
it could be Lazarus as a disciple or as a teacher and influencer of John the presbyter.
It could be.
And the other, because the other.
If it's not Lazarus, it's John the presbyter is what I
Okay.
meant to say.
Oh, okay. Whatever you say.
All right.
Or the disciple whom Jesus loved could be a reference to each and every one of us. But
Well, in some sense that is, although none of us are, we're not put out there as the person who saw this. Whose
so
testimony
that's
is
true.
and
Yes,
such.
right. Yeah.
So there's something to be said for that.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. Well, we both spiritualized it in. Had an interesting scholarly debate here. So then we come to so we have the cross. Jesus is on the cross. The address between Jesus Jesus and his mother, disciple whom he loved. And then after this, when Jesus knew all that was fulfilled, he said, in order to fulfill Scripture, "I am thirsty." And they bring forth a jar full of sour wine. What Scripture verse is John referring to there? And that's something that I didn't get to this week.
Well, so the "I am thirsty" is not the quote. "I am thirsty" is what makes it possible for Jesus to fulfill
The quote. Oh,
Psalm
right.
22.
I see. Yes, great.
So
Okay.
it's really, I think it's Psalm 22:19.
When I was thirsty, they gave me vinegar to drink. Right. Yes.
Precisely.
Okay, right. Yes.
But now this is the neat part, because this is making your point. How does Psalm 22:19 get fulfilled? Jesus calls for it.
Indeed.
Right? So Jesus is exercising his authority, the one who's laying his life down, when he says, I'm thirsty, a la Psalm 22:19.
Right.
So he's even paving the way for the fulfillment of Scripture.
Right. Yes. And then his words after he receives it are, it is finished or it is accomplished is another translation. It echoes that victory shout, which we heard in Mark's gospel, but certainly much more definitive.
Right, and not only echoes that victory shout, but it stands as a counterpoint to the cry of dereliction.
Yes.
So, as you remember in the Synoptic Gospels, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, are the last articulated words. In the Gospel of John, you have Jesus making sure that Scripture is fulfilled, just like he's making arrangements for his mother from the cross, sovereignly acting. And then finally he's saying that I'm done.
I'm done. I've done it.
I've fulfilled everything.
Yes.
Which is rather different than a cry of abandonment, whatever that cry of abandonment means.
Yes, right.
It has a definitely different emotional overtone.
Very much so. Very much so. And then we have, again, a section that is unique to John. They talk about, since it was the day of preparation, the bodies were taken down. They asked Pilate to break the legs of those who were being crucified with him. They found Jesus already dead, and to make sure, they pierced his side with the spear, and at once out came blood and water. Now some have said, well, that means that he was so dead it already coagulated and there was separation. That's certainly one piece. But John is certainly giving us something more symbolic too, I would believe.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is obvious symbolism. I just don't think the symbolism is obvious.
Yes.
I mean, I think it is symbolism, but what it symbolizes is that there's some debate in that. Both water, and I agree with you. I don't think that the purpose here is evidential for Jesus having experienced an actual physical death, although that's not to be doubted. I don't think that's the purpose of this narration. Water and blood both are life coming from Jesus.
Yes.
That's, I think, the one thing that will hold all of the symbols together. It's interesting that in some Jewish interpretation, that in the Targumic literature, which is the Aramaic paraphrases of Old Testament texts and interpretive paraphrases, sort of the Living Bible or the Message of their day with a little more commentary. The stone that Moses struck first bled, and then out of it came life-giving water. So it may be, and this is now reminds us of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the stone was Christ, Paul says.
Right.
It reminds us that this is of an interpretive tradition, that maybe Jesus as the rock that makes provision for his people, from whom is given life.
Right, yes.
There's other possibilities. I like sacramental interpretations too, don't you?
Yes, I think that's a good one.
Okay.
Baptism and Eucharist certainly are there. And yet the line in this section which always strikes me is the last one. They shall look on him whom they have pierced. I have just such memories of hearing that chanted as the last line of the Good Friday Passion, and just the power of that line.
Yeah, and that's a direct quote from Zechariah as well.
Yes.
And I don't know what it evokes for you, but I wonder if it's something like this. When I hear it, it evokes a kind of wistful, sorrowful, what have we done?
Yes.
Is that
very much so? Very much so.
And of course, that's the way that the book of Revelation picks up the same quote. And the sorrow, the gnashing of teeth, the self-loathing. What have we done? I mean, it's turned up a little bit in the book of Revelation, as everything is, but it is that sense.
Yeah, very much so. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left, and it's our custom to take questions. So I don't think we'll go into the burial, although we'll note that it is not just Joseph of Arimathea who's mentioned this time, but Nicodemus as well, the one who came to him by night and to whom Jesus said, you have to be born again. And
would you agree that Nicodemus subplot, though small, a very thin thread in the Gospel of John, is one of its more charming subplots?
I would agree with that.
Because when we read John chapter 3, we have no sense that Nicodemus buys anything that he's hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, what Jesus is telling him is meant for Nicodemus, not
Mm-hmm.
it's just
Yeah.
that's the character of it. But then he shows up in John 7 verse 50, and Nicodemus, who had gone to him before and who was one of them, said to them, "Does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does?" So we have Nicodemus kind of inquisitive, but essentially suspicious of Jesus in John 3. And then we see him next to John 7:50, and he's at least trying to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this Jesus, there's something about this Jesus that makes me sympathetic to him.
Mhm.
We've met. And then now by the end,
He's a disciple, although secretly.
and he helps another disciple come out of the
Was
closet.
it right?
By
To bury Jesus. Yeah.
by burying Jesus. You
Yeah.
can do that in private. And here's Nicodemus all out and attending to Jesus' burial in lavish terms.
Yes, very much so.
So it's that's only a few like plot points, but it is interesting, isn't it? That and I think I don't know, maybe I just need this for sentimental reasons, but I like to think that when I'm reading the Gospels and I see somebody turn away from Jesus, that I'm reading the end of that story, but not the end of their story necessarily.
Mhm. Yeah,
And there may be more. Nicodemus says there can be.
that's true. Yes, I remember as a young priest meditating on that phrase about Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night, and that sense of the dark night of the soul that brings many of us to that final or clearer place of faith. Yeah, good. Yeah. Woody, thank you for being here. Questions from our folks here in the studio audience?
I just like hearing the word studio audience. It just kind of elevates the whole thing, don't you think?
So I think people often, so we've done the 4 Gospels now, and people are accustomed to thinking of the Gospel of John oftentimes contrasted quite strongly with the 3 synoptics.
Mm-hmm.
And I was struck in preparing for Luke last week that a lot of commentaries said that Luke's passion narrative is actually quite similar to John's. I think seeing it tonight, I see a lot more continuity than discontinuity.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if both of you maybe would comment just for folks about how should we think about the Gospel of John in general compared to the others?
Well, I see it as an expansion and if you will, another lens that rounds out, I think, rightly the picture of Jesus that we have through faith. And so there's a part of me that wonders that while John certainly knew the synoptic material and there is the link with Luke, he also is very clear that he wants us he's telling the story in such a way as to make a specific proclamation to a community that needed to hear certain things. And I'm wondering if part of what we're beginning to see in John is the beginning of a Trinitarian theology of 1 and 3, and 3 and 1, with that sense in the beginning was the Word and the Comforter who will come in my name. And that, so I think that there's a corrective, or at least that line about I will lead you. There are many things that I cannot now tell you, which is a Johannine line. I think that we see the fulfillment of much of that in John's gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe if you would let me, maybe instead of corrective, we see a trajectory of development.
Yes.
Would you be okay with that?
I think that's a much better word.
Okay, I didn't mean to correct you, but
No, that's all right.
Okay.
No, I think that's a much better word. A trajectory of thought.
Yeah, I mean the 2 most earliest explicit witnesses we have for the reason that John's gospel was written, I mean outside of John 20 itself, was Clement of Alexandria says that John wrote a more spiritual gospel, and though he implies that he did so knowing the other 3 already. And then there's a weird fragment that I think dates to the late 2nd century called the Muratorian fragment. It's the first list of books of New Testament canon before there was a fixed canon. And there's a long story in there, a relatively long story in there, that that the writer of the Gospel of John got together with the other bishops. By the way, he's a bishop in there, not an apostle. So that's interesting. Anyway, he got together with the other bishops and they fasted and prayed about whether they were discerning whether John should write a gospel. And they determined after fasting and praying that he should. Now, it's pretty clear in that context that the others already existed and they were known. And that there was, in a sense, nothing wrong with them, but that there was room for them to be supplemented. And I think that the kind of supplementing then that you have in the Gospel of John is what the other Gospels imply, John just makes clear.
Yes.
That's sort of what you're
Exactly.
saying.
Mhm.
What the theology that you can wring out of these other narratives, John puts into straightforward words. And so they're I think, a theological supplement, and they are on a trajectory, as you say, beyond beyond the synoptic gospels. But I would make this argument. I don't think the theology of John is so much more advanced than the first three gospels. In other words, it's frequently said that John has a much higher view of Christ. He's more divine. He's fully divine. I actually think, and Kevin actually was a part of a lecture that I gave to this effect about the Gospel of Mark. I think Mark has the same high Christology of Jesus, but his method of disclosure is very discreet and implicit, whereas John is just all out. Jesus speaks openly. The Gospel of John speaks openly. And, thanks be to God for the Gospel of John, because as much trouble as we had as an early church trying to figure out what we believed, can you imagine if we didn't have the Gospel of John to straighten
That's right.
some of
No,
that out,
that's very
right?
true.
I mean,
Very
we'd
true.
all be Arians now,
That's right. Yeah.
at best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hi. One of the things I learned that I found most interesting here was how there's a unity oftentimes in the foreshadowing in the infancy gospels and the passion gospel. Not part of the gospel, but in John, we don't get much of an infancy gospel. We get the hymn to the Logos. So what's the relationship, if any, between the hymn to the Logos and the passion? I mean, they seem to have similarity in that Jesus comes from above and exercises kingship, and John just gives us a more philosophic demonstration of that.
I don't.
Does anybody think that really needs an answer? That was a pretty good
I think it was
comment.
very, very good and very clear. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I would say is what the prologue gives us in discourse form, propositional kind of discourse form, the rest of the gospel narrativizes, if you'll let me make that word up. It narrates it. It turns it into story form, which is, and it's a way of putting on, flesh on the sort of the ideas, the concepts that the prologue promotes. So when you see Jesus saying, "Look, I'm thirsty," this is going to fulfill Scripture. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is Jesus, the sovereign one, but it's in story form. So that would be one way maybe to think about it.
Indeed. Okay. Well, I think, are we at the end of our time,
One
Kim?
more question.
Okay. Well, we have two people with hands up, so. Okay, maybe take two. Patricia.
Well, quick question. Talking about zealous policing, got to be thinking about grand juries and things like that. Do you think a transcript of Pilate's encounter with Jesus actually existed? And if it did, wouldn't Josephus or someone like that have had more evidence for Jesus' existence and who he was and things of that sort?
Well, we certainly know that Josephus does refer to both Pilate and to Jesus in his commentary. I doubt that they kept trial transcripts, would be my guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important to remember for us who worship Jesus and who we see as the transformation of the world order, that he was a backwater, no account, messianic pretender by anybody else's account.
Yeah.
So the press corps didn't follow Jesus around. His followers followed him around. And therefore, what we know of Jesus is going to come in those from those kind of testimonies. And it shouldn't surprise us that that's the case. But my answer would be no. I'm quite sure there would be anything like a transcript, and that's why Josephus wouldn't have. What Josephus tells us about Jesus is minimal, and it's corroborative with what we read in the Gospels, but it's rather minimal.
I'm wondering where does the detail of this conversation come from? Is it made up, or is it real?
Is there a place that we could imagine between completely made up and a narrative that fills in gaps of a historical event? I think that's what we have throughout most of the Gospels. Things that actually happened, maybe a 3-hour conversation that Jesus has with Nicodemus that's reduced into 37 seconds that we can read. And did it go just like that? Those words, this statement, that word? Probably not. But did that 37-second summary get the gist of that encounter? Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of an in-between place between a kind of excessive literalism and pure fiction, which I don't think either of those are quite right.
I would agree. One more question.
One more last quick question from Pat.
Well, yeah.
I'm sure it will be.
I'm sure it will be. The line from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Mm-hmm.
Could you say more about that? That seems the essence of suffering.
Well, yeah, it does. John doesn't record that in the way that.
So we're done.
So but so it's interesting to look at. On the one hand, in the synoptics, we have this cry of dereliction. In the John's gospel, you have the "it is accomplished," and I think what the beauty of that is, if Irenaeus is right, which I believe he is, that Jesus lived human life in its fullness, then we have in those pictures of Jesus on the cross both the sense of abandonment that each of us have felt in our own hours of struggle and pain, and we have that sense of clear victory, which we come from knowing Jesus as Lord, not by anything that we've done, but only by God's grace. And I think one of the beauties of the Holy Week liturgy is that we hear both of those each year. We hear the cry of dereliction in the Passion reading on Palm Sunday, and we hear the clear statement of "it is finished" in the Passion reading from John on Good Friday. And I think that any picture of Jesus' passion without both those things is incomplete.
And perhaps that's why the Palm Sunday's liturgy is like it is, because we get that whole picture all within the course of one Sunday.
That's very true.
Service.
Very true. I want to invite everybody to join us at the cathedral for our Holy Week liturgies. Palm Sunday Psalm liturgy at 10 a.m. And then the liturgies for Holy Week are on your website. The dean will be preaching, I'll be preaching, and we look forward to having you with us in worship in this most holy place. And thanks again to the dean for organizing this event this Lenten season. Mr. Dean.
Well, thank you very much, Bishop. Thank you, Woody. And thank you all who have joined us for these past few weeks. We know that we have had viewers near and afar, and we hope that you will either join us here at All Saints or in your own parish church, wherever you find yourself during this Holy Week, and have a blessed Easter. Thank you.